We appreciate all of the guests who have appeared on our show and sincerely thank them for providing you, our audience, with useful information. However, the advice our guests provide is theirs, and we encourage you to seek out a professional if you have specific questions about any topic we cover on the Crushing Debt podcast. On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast, attorney Christie Arkovich.
Welcome to the Crushing Debt Podcast with your host, Florida attorney Sean Yesner, where our goal is to help you get rid of the financial bullies in your life.
So welcome back to another episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. My laryngitis voice name is Sean Yesner, and I have a guest with me on this week's episode, Christie Arkovich, back for her fourth episode recording overall. So welcome, Christie.
Thank you, Sean, for the opportunity.
So in the last couple of episodes, Christie and I were talking a lot about bankruptcy law and a lot about student loan law and the way that we can use bankruptcy or we can use some non-bankruptcy alternatives to eliminate student loan debt. But this time we're going to switch it up. We're going to talk about another type of consumer law, the TCPA, or the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. So I know what it is. I've dabbled in it a little bit, but I haven't done a lot with it. So why don't you tell us, what is the TCPA?
Sure. Well, you know how you get those robocalls all the time? Telemarketers, debt collectors, everybody calling your cell phone at all hours. That's what this law is intended to prevent. It's to stop robocalling, basically auto dialers calling you. And it has some pretty powerful incentives. A consumer can actually obtain $1,500 of damages for every single call. All they have to do is tell the people that are calling their cell phone, the companies, not to call their cell phone any longer. It's not hard. And so if more people would fight back and would tell people not to call their cell phones, these companies are making millions of robocalls per day. I think the FTC said that there were like 4.5 billion of robocalls made in the last year. And it's something that's everybody has an issue with. Conservative, liberal, judges, everyone hates robocalls. So it's an issue that all of us can stand behind. And I think it's an important law out there.
Yeah, now by robocalls, you mean the phone rings and it's not a person at the other end.
Well, no, it actually can be a live person. That's one of the confusing things. Most people think of TCPA, the law, only protecting against auto pre-recorded calls where you've got a computer on the other end of the phone. And that's not true at all. It's any company that violates the non-consent laws by using an auto dialer. And pretty much these companies, every phone system that they have, if you connect the dots between them, they're capable of storing and retrieving numbers in a way that's protected under the TCPA. It's called an auto dialer or predictive dialer. And when they use that machinery, they're capable of making millions of calls per month. And so that's how a consumer can get 20 calls in one day. It's not someone on the other end that's hand dialing 10 numbers each time. It's this computer system that's calling them. But it can be a live person that gets on the phone right away. Typically what you'll see is the call will start with a brief hesitation or a clicking sound, maybe even a delay, maybe even a longer delay, but you probably will have a robocall or auto dial call at that time. If it's a pre-recorded voice message, it absolutely is an auto dialed call.
Right.
And all of those are in violation if you've simply told them not to call your cell phone. And in Florida, verbally telling them is just as good as telling them in writing.
So then what's the difference between the TCPA and, for example, the do not call list?
Well, the TCPA has teeth. The FTC, they get 200,000 complaints every month about robocalls, but they can't sue on 200,000 cases per month. And so you've got private attorneys out here, such as myself, that will be able to privately enforce this law. And so we bring actions under the TCPA, and we can obtain $500 minimum per call, up to $1,500 if willful. And the way you prove willful is you tell them multiple times not to call. They'll probably ignore you every time. And the other way is we see the same repeat offenders. It's the same companies doing these calls every month. we're not going after the good ones. If they stop calling, great. Then they've abided by the law. We have no reason to sue them. But we're going after the repeat offenders that get sued, a few times a month. And for whatever reason, the $1,500 a call, while it sounds like a lot of money to you and me. I mean, 100 calls at $1,500, that's $150,000.
Right.
And that seems like a lot of money for someone who just had to ignore their cell phone for a couple of months. But on the other hand, you have to have a powerful law like this, or else you won't have any deterrent at all. And you'll have situations where, here's an example. I listened to a client's voicemail earlier this morning, and it was a wrong number call. And so she answered the call, and she said, I'm not the person you're trying to reach. You've got the wrong number. And you know what the company did on the other side? They didn't say, oh, my bad, I'm sorry, we'll take you out of our records, we'll correct this, we'll make sure it never happens again, no apologies. No, instead what they did is they said, what's the best time to reach you? And there's absolutely no reason for them to ever have called this person again, but obviously it went in one ear and out the other.
Right.
That was an unwanted call. And so that person had to sue. One of the more favorable laws in Florida that allows verbal revocation of consent to call, where you just simply tell them not to call, came about because of someone who they took their relative to the emergency room and they signed the emergency contact form. And so when their grandparent couldn't pay the entire bill, or there was something left over after Medicare, did their thing, that person got 800 collection calls for their grandparent simply because they signed an emergency contact form. And they told this debt collector, hey, I'm not this grandparent, this is not me, blah, blah, blah. And they could never stop the calls. And so they also had to sue. And so we're starting to see a lot more lawsuits with very substantial damages because the amount of calls using this kind of equipment escalates very quickly into hundreds or thousands of calls. And when you get to hundreds of calls and thousands of calls, and it's at all times of the night, it's when you're in the bathroom, it's when you're at work, but yet you have to leave your phone on because you have a child in daycare or something like that.
Right.
You have the possibility of getting punitive and emotional damages as well. But even though you have all this deterrent out there, you still have the bad actors doing the same thing over and over again. And as of yet, they haven't changed their tactics.
Well, and it's the same old analysis. I'm going to make X number of calls, and that'll generate me, however much money in terms of collections. And for every once or two times, three times, whatever, I get popped by the TCPA, who cares? I'll just pay out. And then I'll go back to collecting however many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars from all the other unsuspecting people.
That's exactly what we see. And I'm probably aging myself a little bit here, but I don't know if you remember. Do you remember the Ford Pintos that would explode in the 70s or whatever years it was? Well, it came out in litigation. This was well before I was an attorney. I think I was barely born, for that matter. But the legal department of, I guess it was Ford, must have made the decision somewhere, and it was in writing, that they had decided to pay off the families of the deceased or injured people from the Ford Pintos exploding because the gas tanks were located at the rear and they were rear-ended, rather than doing the recall, because financially the recall would have cost them a lot more money.
Right.
And so with these TCPA cases, there's so few people suing for that because, frankly, most people will block their calls. In fact, on the way here, I was driving here, and I had a friend that he texted me something, and he said, sue them for me, because I'd posted something on Facebook. And all in the same minute, he received 7 calls, and he's using some kind of application that says potential fraud auto blocked, and so he blocked his calls. But he got 7 calls all in the same minute, and it might have been more. This is just one screenshot he sent me 10 minutes before I showed up today. So you can block your calls, yes. You can file a complaint with the FTC, 200,000 people do a month. But why not fight back in a way that might actually make a difference?
Yeah.
If you just simply tell them not to call, which is very easy to do, and then keep track of when you do that, write a note about it, and then take screenshots of every call that you get. It's very easy because you have to check your phone anyway to see who's calling.
Right.
And it's 2 presses of a button to take a screenshot. And sue them, because at $1,500 a call, if enough people out there do this, we might actually have a TCPA that not only has teeth, but actually gets the job done. And we can't count on our federal government to do this for us, because this is a day and age that the dollars spent for public enforcement of our FCC laws and so forth are diminishing. And so it's important that we have laws like this that allow private attorneys and their clients to go after debt collectors to stop the robocalls, or else we'll just have these calls continuing each and every day.
Yeah, and so one other thing I wanted to talk to you about specifically with the TCPA, I know under the FDCPA and the FCCPA, which are the, most people know them as you can't call before 8 or 9, 7 or 8 in the morning. You can't call after 8 or 9 at night. The TCPA, I think, is within that family of laws, but I think where they're a little bit different, if I recall correctly, the FDCPA and the FCCPA have provisions in there where the lender will pay the attorney's fees when the borrower prevails in the lawsuit. But as I recall, the TCPA doesn't have that type of attorney fee provision in it, does it?
It does not. What happens is with the FDCPA and its Florida counterpart, the FCCPA, they have the attorney's fee provision, but they don't have that much in damages. They only have $1,000 statutory damage, not per violation or per phone call. They also have emotional and punitive damage potential too. The TCPA has no recovery of attorney's fees, but it's a per call violation. So most TCPA cases are brought on a contingency fee basis. Usually we're looking for a substantial number of calls to make it worthwhile. I'm not suing on 10 calls generally because it takes too much time and effort to build up that complaint. But when you combine them, and if you have a TCPA violation, if you have a cell phone violation, then technically that's also a violation of the FCCPA and FDCPA because of the harassing nature of the phone call. They are continuing the call after you've told them not to. That separate violation of law is a violation of the FCCPA. So we simply link all of these laws together. And when we have a consultation with our clients, which are free, by the way, we ask them questions as to, have you gotten calls before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m.? If so, we allege the FCCPA or FDCPA.
Right.
And the TCPA, any call, no matter what time of day, no matter if it's weekends or weekdays, all of them are improper once you've told them not to call. But the key is linking all the laws together. It also makes the case much more likely to settle. The judges are much happier to go after what they see as a bad actor, an abuser of all these laws. They want people to follow the laws. And it's actually hurting good companies too, because good companies arguably probably aren't making as much money if they're not trying to illegally collect the debt like some of the bad actors are. So it's doing a service for them as well.
Wow. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time again. Plus, who knows how much longer my voice is going to hold out here. But anything else you wanted to say about the TCPA? No,
just think of it as an excellent way to stop robocalls. And yes, you always have the way to block the number and file a complaint with the FTC. But why not be more aggressive? Keep track of the calls, bring your own lawsuit. We work on a contingency fee basis, which means our fees and costs come strictly out of any recovery. And we can be reached. Our website is ChristieArkovich.com, and we have a phone number of 813-258-2808. And there's been a lot of good case law in the last few months on the TCPA. Hopefully that will continue. But here in Florida, it's a very viable act to obtain real damages and maybe help stop these robocalls.
Yeah. Well, I thank you again for being a guest on this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast. I will post your contact information in the show notes so anybody listening will have it there. And thank you again, Christie. Guest spot number 4, and we're still cooking, so I will definitely have you back for future episodes. But that's all the time we have for this week's episode, and I look forward to talking to you in next week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast.
If you have questions that you think would make a great topic for a future episode, please email Sean or connect with us on social media. Sean Yesner and Yesner Law, PL, are Florida licensed attorneys. The information contained in this week's episode is not a substitute for legal advice. Your situation may differ, especially if you are located somewhere other than the state of Florida. If you have questions, please contact our office or contact a local attorney. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast.